Hello, you're listening to The Olive Tree with me, Julia Fisher, the program that brings you the stories of both Jewish and Arab believers in Jesus living in Israel and the wider Middle East. On a recent visit to Israel, I met Dina Sered. Her husband Dan is director of Jews for Jesus in Israel. Dina has a remarkable story of her own, as she now explains.
I was raised in a believing home. My father, who's not Jewish, is from Guatemala, and my mom is Jewish from Colombia. I was raised to know my dad's name was Eli, my mom's name is Annie, and the Messiah is Jesus. So I didn't have any type of complex a lot of Jewish people have when they come into faith, and I just knew that it's the most Jewish thing to believe in Jesus. My father was actually raised in Guatemala, and he came to the States when he was 17. He became a believer through the work of an American missionary, Hazel Edwards, who had come to Guatemala and shared the gospel with little children. And it was through her ministry in his life that he became a believer. And just to talk a little bit about Hazel, she had an opportunity to be married and to go to Africa and be a missionary wife in Africa, but she chose God's work for her in Guatemala. And through her, so many children, hundreds of children, have come to the Lord. She kept in touch with my parents, and my mom at one point told her, "You have missionary grandchildren." And that's all because of the work you've done in Guatemala and in Honduras. So I really thank God for missionaries. It's because of the work that she did that I had a godly upbringing. My father's upbringing was not godly at all, but God redeemed himself, redeemed my dad, and gave me a wonderful, wonderful childhood. My mom became a believer at the age of 12 through some ladies at a local church knocking on doors, and invited them to go, and my mom was the only one to answer the call. Now, when she was 3 years old, through secular Jewish parents, she said, "God, if you really exist, make sure that when I'm older, I know you." So when she was invited to the service, and she came, and she realized that this was a place where God was, and she gave her life to Jesus, and she's never left him since. So for me, God is this real person, this tangible person. I just can't see him, but he's so there. He's so real. And growing up, she would know when I was spending time with the Lord or not. She'd say, put her hands on her hips, and she'd say, "Dina, you haven't been spending time with the Lord. I think you need to march in your room and have some time with God, and then come down and be with the rest of the family." So growing up was a wonderful just experience, and understanding that it's not about church. It's really not about religion. It had nothing to do with religion. It really had to do with having a relationship with God and how God would affect every part of your life. So as going to college and going to school, that's what we would talk about. Not so much about politics. That wasn't my forte, but it was about who I am, what I wanted to do, and who I was. Had everything to do with Jesus and my relationship with him, and wanting to share that with others.
You went to university in the States, which is where you met your husband. He started to help you with your maths.
Yes, math is not my forte, although I did do 4 semesters of calculus, but it was that need for help that drove me to the Math Learning Center, and that's where I found Dan. He was very helpful, and I struck up a conversation with him and found out that he was Jewish, and we started finding out about each other and where we were from. He had a Slavic accent, I am sure of it. He lost it just to mock me because I thought he was from Russia. And he said, no, he's from Israel. I told him that I was Jewish too. He asked me if I was part of the Hillel group, which is a Jewish kids club on campus. And I told him forthrightly that they don't like me very much because I happened to come into one of their club meetings with a T-shirt that said "Jesus made me kosher," and they didn't really they didn't appreciate that. But I was very obvious. I was very upfront about my faith and would like to share with all the other kids on campus. And so he said, "I don't like that kind of scene either. I'm not a party person." But he had heard me say Yeshua, and he wanted to know who that was, and I said, that's Jesus' name in Hebrew. And for him, that was it. He just understood. It made sense for him, it didn't make sense to me that he understood that Jesus could be the Messiah just from that statement, but he believed from that point and asked to know more. And we sat down and we shared the scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, and after we spoke about Isaiah and Genesis and Micah, he later asked me, what do you think my parents are going to say? And I was floored at that point because I knew he had received everything that he had read from the Word. And I told him the truth. I said, if our people despise the prophets and rejected the word of the Lord, I believe your parents are not going to like what you have to say to them. And so a few days later, I asked him if he would like to ask Jesus into his heart, and he said that he did, only that he wanted to do it by himself. So I wrote out a sinner's prayer for him, and he said, I'm going to tell my parents about what I'm about to do. Of course, I was a bit nervous because I knew what their reaction would be. So I wrote out the prayer, and I immediately went home and called folks from my church and called my parents who are pastoring on Long Island even today to come together and pray for this young man. And we prayed that the Lord would give him 3 months. I don't know where the 3 months came from, but the Lord gave us 3 months, and his parents did not react at all. They acted as if it was a phase he was going through and left him alone. And for 3 months, he had solid teachings with my mom and dad about his newfound faith. And after the 3 months was over, everything went crazy. His parents realized that it was a real thing and gave him a lot of problems. Eventually, he had to leave the home. And that was the beginning of his faith, but he knew who he believed in and couldn't be persuaded to go back to a life without Jesus.
When did you realize that you were going to become his wife? There's more to this than just a conversation about faith.
Well, I started to fall in love with Dan, and I tell you, I thought, this is the work of the enemy trying to put his oars in. I just want this young guy to grow in the Lord and really mature in him. And I was just interested in God myself. I wasn't ready to get married. Therefore, as my mom said, if you're not ready to get married, you shouldn't be looking for any type of relationship. So I just thought it was just the enemy's ploy to get him to get me away from my focus, which was on God, and to distract him from his new faith. And so at first I was really rejecting the whole process.
So what happened?
So then I went to England. I visited a friend. Actually, before that, I would always love listening to stories of married couples. How did you get together? I knew there was a formula that God had, that they would know that this was it, right? There's so many divorced people. I wanted to know what the secret was behind knowing who God had intended for you. And I'm telling you, every one of them, from my mom to my aunts and people at church, everyone said the same thing. Oh, my husband, I thought he was terrible, or I wasn't interested, or he felt like a brother to me. And I was freaking out because I knew a lot of, Jewish believers or believers that I was not interested in at all. And I said, oh, I would just hate it for it to be this person or that person or the other person. And so I said in my heart, I would really love to have a crush on a guy and have them like me in the same way. And so I went to England, visited my friend, and I asked this wonderful godly couple, so how did you know that your husband was the one for you and designed for you by the Lord? And she said, well, I fell in love with my husband first, and my husband loved me too, but he didn't understand the love that he had for me. He kept on saying, Lord, help me to love everyone as much as I love. Heather was her name. And he would feel the same for everyone else. And all of a sudden, his affection for Heather would grow. And he said, Lord, this isn't right. I need to love all my brothers and sisters the same in the Lord. And of course, it would come down to the level he would love everybody the same, but his affection for Heather would grow. Until finally a friend pretty much just, gave him a little nudge in the shoulder and said, this is what God has for you. This is the one that you're meant to be with. And they had wonderful prayer time, and they'd been married for over 30 years. And I said, wow, that's a wonderful story. I really like that story because it's different from all the other stories I'd heard. So I came back, and Dan and I were friends. We would study together. And I told him this story, and as soon as I told him that story, he picked up his books and left. And the next day he said, Dina, I need to talk to you. And I got this little tingling in the pit of my stomach. I figured maybe he has something special to tell me, but I wasn't sure, and I couldn't. No. Because I figured my affection for Dan is just that of the Lord. Remember, I had that inner struggle. And so he came and he says, Dina, you know what I'm going to say. And I said, I have no idea what you're going to say. And he told me how he felt about me. And I put my hands on my hips because I was very scared. I said, what makes you think you could tell me that? He said, well, because because I think that the Lord wants us to be married. That's the word I wanted to hear. I didn't want just a relationship just for him to like me and become boyfriend for what, and see if we're going to get married. So he said, well, actually, the Lord told me. I said, what? The Lord told you? Tell me what he said. So he was a new believer, remember, and he didn't know where anything was in Scripture. And my mom had told him anytime I had something very special to ask the Lord would always show me in his word. So he just takes that on faith, and he says that's how the Lord speaks to everybody. So he says, Lord, when Dina told me that story about Heather and Ron, I realized, he had been having the same prayer. He'd ask the Lord to give him the same love for all of his brothers and sisters as he was feeling for me, and then his affection for me would grow. And then he said, no, this isn't right. I need to love everybody the same. So when he heard me sharing the story about Ron and his wife, it was the same story. So he said to the Lord, am I supposed to marry Dina? And he said, if I'm supposed to marry Dina, then give me a scripture about love. And the first one was love your neighbor as yourself. And he said, wow, that's amazing, but I need another one. And the Lord gave him 7. And after the 7th one, it was specifically about a love between a husband and wife. And so he knew that this affection was a lifelong affection and a love that was supposed to last for all our time here on earth. And so that's what made it special for me, because I wanted confirmation from the Lord, that just like he had given confirmation to my parents as well. And I know the Lord will give us what our heart's desire is. And my heart's desire for a husband was that he would love the Lord with all of his heart. Then, number 2, love my family, because they're crazy. And I love them so much. So I wanted him to feel a part of my family. I wanted him to feel like a son to my parents, a brother to my siblings. And that's exactly what he is. God has given me the desires of my heart.
Dina Sered sharing her story. And you're listening to The Olive Tree with me, Julia Fisher. The Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund is a Christian charity based in the UK that supports the needs of both Jewish believers and Arab Christians living in Israel and the wider Middle East. If you would like to know more about our work and receive our free bi-monthly newsletter, please either visit our website, olivetreefund.org, or write to me, Julia Fisher, at the Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund, P.O. Box 850, Horsham, RH12 9GA in the UK. I'll be back at the same time next week with another story from the Olive Tree. Until then, goodbye.